John Delorean, Iacocca, two titans of the automotive industry. What did they do for the car world as we know it? Did you know there's a connection between them? Even though it's a bit of a stretch, but it's an interesting connection nonetheless. Hello, I'm your host, Gary Neidert. Thanks for listening to My First Ride podcast. If you haven't noticed yet, this podcast is about nostalgia. You know, reliving the events, the sights, the smells, and the emotions of special memories connected to our first rides. Said another way, it's about allowing our memories to travel back in time to experience special moments all over again. During the past week, I watched a show that highlighted the history and the impact of the automotive industry on the American culture. It was entertaining, and I learned a lot about some of the innovators that influenced the designs of what we drive today. Two men stood out as the most interesting. And I guess it was because they impacted the cars that I grew up with in my teens. Who were they? John Delorean and Iacocca. Both were leaders in the automotive industry, but with totally different styles. Because there's so much to talk about with both men, this is going to require 2 episodes to tell their stories. Today I'm going to talk about John Delorean and some of his accomplishments, along with some connections to a few celebrities. Next week, I'll talk about Iacocca, his accomplishments, and the connection he had to John Delorean, even though it was a little bit of a stretch, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. So let's get right into it now as I talk about John Delorean and his colorful story. All right, let's jump right into this. As in the past, I go to Wikipedia to get a lot of information. Sometimes I'm able to find out other good sources for good information, but this is going to come primarily from Wikipedia because there's a whole lot more information available to read than what I'm able to share today. So here we go. Wikipedia talks about John Zachary Delorean. He was an American engineer, inventor, and executive in the U.S. automobile industry, widely known for his work at General Motors and as a founder of the Delorean Motor Company. He managed the development of a number of vehicles throughout his career, including the Pontiac Gto muscle car, the Pontiac Firebird, and I talked about that in another episode, the Pontiac Grand Prix. I never knew about this one. This was pretty cool. The Chevrolet Cosworth Vega and the DMC DeLorean sports car, which was featured in the 1985 film Back to the Future. He was the youngest division head in General Motors history up until 1973, when he left to start the DeLorean Motor Company. So a little bit of a detailed history on him. In 1943, Delorean was drafted for military service, and he served 3 years in the U.S. Army and received an honorable discharge. While in college, he worked part-time at Chrysler and at a local body shop, foreshadowing his later contributions to the automotive industry. I'm sure he learned a lot in working both in the body shop and at Chrysler. Delorean graduated in 1948 with a Bachelor of Science degree in Industrial Engineering. Now, instead of immediately entering the engineering workforce after earning his degree, Delorean sold life insurance. He developed an analytical system aimed at engineers and sold about $850,000 worth of policies in 10 months. Now, that was in 1948-49 money, so that's quite a bit. However, he found the work boring and moved on to work for the Factory Equipment Corporation. Delorean states in his autobiography that he sold life insurance to improve his communication skills. It's a great idea. Both endeavors were successful financially, but these areas had little interest for Delorean. A foreman at Chrysler's engineering garage recommended that Delorean apply for work at Chrysler, and Delorean agreed. Chrysler ran a postgraduate educational facility named the Chrysler Institute of Engineering, which allowed Delorean to advance his education while gaining real-world experience in automotive engineering. Delorean's time at Chrysler lasted less than a year. In 1953, he was offered a salary of $14,000 at that time, which in 2020 money would have been $135,000. Pretty good for that time. This was at Packard Motor Company under the supervision of the engineer Forrest McFarlane. However, Packard was experiencing financial difficulties when Delorean joined because of the changing post-World War II automotive market. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had begun producing affordable mainstream products designed to cater to the rising post-war middle class. Packard, though, clung to their pre-World War II era notions of high-end, precisely engineered luxury cars. This exclusive philosophy was to take its toll on its profitability, but it proved to have a positive effect on Delorean's attention to engineering detail. And after 4 years at Packard, he became McFarlane's successor as head of research and development. While still a profitable company, Packard suffered alongside other independents as it struggled to compete when Ford and General Motors engaged in a price war. James Nance, president of Packard, decided to merge the company with Studebaker Corporation in 1954. Later, a proposed merger with American Motors Corporation, or AMC, never passed the discussion phase. Delorean considered keeping his job and moving to Studebaker headquarters in South Bend, Indiana. That all changed when he received a call from Oliver K. Kelly, vice president of engineering at General Motors, a man whom Delorean greatly admired. Kelly called to offer Delorean his choice of a job in any of 5 divisions of GM. So in 1956, Delorean accepted the offer. The salary, $16,000. He got a raise, which was equivalent to $152,000 in 2020, along with the bonus program. He chose to work at GM's Pontiac division as an assistant to Chief Engineer Pete Estes and General Manager Simon Bunky Knudsen. Hope I said your name there right, Simon, Mr. Knudsen. Knudsen was the son of the former president of GM, William Knudsen, who was called away from his post to head the war mobilization production effort at the request of President Roosevelt. Knudsen was also an MIT engineering graduate, and at 42, at that time, he was the youngest man to head a division of GM. Delorean and Knudsen quickly became close friends, and Delorean eventually called Knudsen a major influence and mentor. DeLorean's years of engineering at Pontiac were successful, producing dozens of patented innovations for the company, and in 1961, he was promoted to the position of Division Chief Engineer. So DeLorean was widely known at Pontiac for the Pontiac Gto, which it was from Gran Turismo Omologato. The GTO was a muscle car named after the Ferrari 250 GTO. As a slightly bigger Chevrolet, the Pontiac brand reached third place in total annual industry sales in the United States. To highlight the performance emphasis of the brand, the GTO debuted as a Tempest/Le Mans option package with a larger and more powerful engine in 1964. This marked the beginning of Pontiac's renaissance as GM's performance division, instead of its previous position with no clear brand identity. The car and its popularity continued to grow in the following years. DeLorean received almost total credit for its success, conceptualizing, engineering, and marketing. He had become the golden boy of Pontiac and was rewarded with his 1965 promotion to head the entire Pontiac division. At the age of 40, DeLorean had broken the record for the youngest division head at GM and was determined to continue his string of successes. Adapting to the frustrations that he perceived in the executive offices was a difficult transition for him. DeLorean believed there was a unique amount of infighting at GM between division heads, and several of Pontiac's advertising campaign themes met with internal resistance, such as the Tiger campaign used to promote the GTO and other Pontiac models in 1965 and 1966. In addition, there was Ed Cole's decision to ban multiple carburetors. This was a method of enhancing engine performance used by Pontiac since 1956. It started with two four-barrel carburetors, and then the Tri-Power, which was a 3 two-barrel carburetor setup. In response to the, quote, pony car market dominated by the wildly successful Ford Mustang, Lee Iacocca's design, DeLorean asked GM executives for permission to market a smaller version of the Pontiac Banshee show car for 1966. DeLorean's version was rejected because of GM's concern that his vehicle would take away sales from the Corvette, which was their flagship performance vehicle. Their focus was on the new Camaro design. Pontiac developed its version, and the Firebird was introduced for the 1967 model year. Shortly after the Firebird's introduction, DeLorean turned his attention to the development of an all-new Grand Prix, the division's personal luxury car based on the full-size Pontiac line since 1962. The 1969 model would have its own distinct body shell and drivetrain and chassis components from the intermediate-size Pontiac A-body, which was the Tempest, Le Mans, and the GTO. DeLorean knew Pontiac division couldn't finance the new car alone, so he went to his former boss, Pete Estes, and asked to share the cost of development with Pontiac. The result? They agreed on a 1-year exclusivity before Chevrolet would release the 1970 Monte Carlo. The deal was done. The 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix featured sharp body lines and a 6-foot-long hood. Big long hood. I remember a friend of mine had one of those. It was a pretty car. The interior included a wraparound cockpit-style instrument panel, bucket seats, and center console. The new model offered a sportier, high-performance, somewhat smaller, and lower-priced alternative to other personal luxury cars then on the market, such as the Ford Thunderbird, the Buick Riviera, the Lincoln Continental Mark III, and the Oldsmobile Tornado. The 1969 Grand Prix production ended up at over 112,000 units, which was far higher than the 32,000 1968 Grand Prix units built from the full-size Pontiac body. During his time at Pontiac, Delorean had begun to enjoy the freedom and celebrity lifestyle that came with his position and spent a good deal of his time traveling to locations around the world to support promotional events. His frequent public appearances helped to solidify his image as a rebel corporate businessman with his trendy dress style and casual banter. Even as General Motors experienced revenue declines, Pontiac remained highly profitable under Delorean, and despite his growing reputation as a corporate maverick, February 15, 1969, he was again promoted. This time, it was to head up the prestigious Chevrolet division, General Motors' flagship marquee. By this time, February of 1969, he was a well-known fixture in popular culture. At a time when business executives were typically conservative, low-key individuals in three-piece suits, Delorean, he wore long sideburns and unbuttoned shirts. He was later a limited partner in a pair of American professional sports franchises. The first was the San Diego Chargers in August of 1966. The other was the New York Yankees, of which he was one of 15 investors led by George Steinbrenner and Michael Burke, who completed the purchase from CBS for $10 million on January 3, 1973. Now, the executives at General Motors headquarters continued to clash with DeLorean's nonconformity. When he was appointed, Chevrolet was having financial and organizational troubles, and GM President Ed Cole needed a manager in that position to sort things out. The new model Camaro was due out for the 1970 model year, and it was rapidly falling behind schedule. Redesigns for the Corvette and Nova were also delayed, and unit sales had still not recovered from the past 4 years of turmoil, much of that because of the bad publicity surrounding the Corvair and well-publicized quality control issues affecting other Chevy models, which included defective motor mounts that led to an unprecedented recall of 6.7 million Chevrolets built between 1965 and 1969. Man, that's a bunch of cars to recall, you know? DeLorean responded to the production problems by delaying the release of the Camaro and simplifying the modifications to the Corvette and Nova. He used the extra time to streamline Chevrolet's production overhead and reduce assembly cost. By 1971, Chevrolet was experiencing record sales in excess of 3 million vehicles, and his division alone was nearly matching that of the entire Ford company. How about that? His next big project was the Vega. Oh, man, what a thing to be in charge of. But, you know, that's okay. What I'm about to read here, though, is really interesting, and I think he really was wanting to pay attention to detail with it. So the Vega was assigned to Chevrolet by corporate management, specifically by GM President Ed Cole, just weeks before DeLorean's 1969 arrival as Chevrolet Division's general manager. In a Motor Trend interview in August of 1970, DeLorean said, "Vega will be the highest quality product ever built by Chevrolet." By DeLorean's orders, dozens of extra inspectors were assigned to the Vega assembly line, and the first 2,000 cars were road tested. He stated, "The first cars, from a manufacturing standpoint, were well built." But in 1972, General Motors Assembly Division took over the Chevrolet Lordstown Assembly Plant and the adjoining Fisher Body Plant. Their main goal was to cut costs, and more than 800 workers were laid off, many of whom were additional inspectors. This led to assembly line vandalism, with workers intentionally slowing the line, leaving off parts, and installing others improperly. Incomplete and often non-functioning cars soon filled the factory lot, which then had to be root processed and repaired by a team assigned to this task by DeLorean. A 1-month strike followed, and dealers did not receive enough cars for the demand in 1972. DeLorean regrouped for the 1973 model year with Vegas sales of 395,000, almost 400,000 units. The 1 millionth Vega was built in May 1973, a month after DeLorean's GM resignation. In 1972, DeLorean was appointed to the position of Vice President of Car and Truck Production for the entire General Motors line, and his eventual rise to President seemed inevitable. However, the idea of him assuming that position was almost intolerable to GM executives. And on April 2nd of 1973, he announced that he was leaving the company, telling the press, "I want to do things in the social area. I have to do them, and unfortunately, the nature of our business just didn't permit me to do as much as I wanted." However, it had been rumored that he had been fired. GM gave him a Florida Cadillac franchise as a retirement gift, and DeLorean took over the presidency of the National Alliance of Businessmen, a charitable organization with the mission of employing Americans in need, founded by Lyndon Johnson and Henry Ford II. GM was a major contributor to the group and agreed to continue his salary while he remained president of NAB. DeLorean left General Motors in 1973 to form his own company, the DeLorean Motor Company. A 2-seat sports car prototype was shown in the mid-70s, and it was called the DeLorean Safety Vehicle. The car entered into production as the DeLorean. The car's body distinctively used stainless steel and featured gull-wing doors. It was powered by a V6 engine that was developed by Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo. And that engine was known as the PRV for, Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo. Production delays meant the DeLorean did not reach the consumer market until January of 1981, nearly a decade after the company was founded. And in the interim, the new car market had slumped considerably due to the 1980 U.S. economic recession. This was compounded by unexpectedly lukewarm reviews from critics and the public, who generally felt the uniqueness of DeLorean's styling did not compensate for the higher price and lower horsepower related to other sport coupes on the market. While interest in the DeLorean quickly dwindled, competing models with lower price tags and more powerful engines, such as the Chevrolet Corvette, sold in record numbers during the 1980 to 1981 timeframe, in spite of the ongoing recession. I talked about that on the 500,000th Corvette, how the Corvettes continued to sell well during that time frame. By February of 1982, more than half of the roughly 7,000 DeLoreans produced remain unsold. DMC, or DeLorean Motor Company, was $175 million in debt, and the Dunmurry factory was placed in receivership. After going into receivership in February of 1982, DMC produced another 2,000 cars until John DeLorean's arrest in late October, at which point liquidation proceedings were undertaken and the factory was seized by the British government for good. The DeLorean Motor Company name was subsequently owned by a Texas-based firm that provided parts and professional restoration to DeLorean owners. Although John DeLorean was not involved in the business, its vice president, James Espy, spoke with him on the phone once a month. And according to Espy, in their final conversation, DeLorean expressed his dismay at the direction of General Motors, saying, "They have too many bean counters and not enough engineers." On October 19, 1982, DeLorean was charged by the U.S. government with trafficking cocaine following a videotaped sting operation in which he was recorded by undercover federal agents agreeing to bankroll a cocaine smuggling operation. He did this to try to get money to fund the DeLorean Motor Car Company. On September 21, 1985, DeLorean was indicted on charges he defrauded investors and committed tax evasion by diverting millions of dollars raised for the company to himself. He was acquitted of all charges. Sounds very similar to the Tucker story. So to compete against the big three is kind of difficult to do. Now, I'm not excusing his thing of trying to sell the cocaine to fund the business, but it's hard to go up against the big three, the establishment. You can't buck the establishment. On September 21, 1985, DeLorean was indicted on charges he defrauded investors and committed tax evasion by diverting millions of dollars raised for the company to himself. He was later acquitted of all charges. DeLorean was married 4 times. He married Elizabeth Higgins on September 3, 1954. They divorced in 1969. Now pay attention to this next little bit. Here's the celebrity connection. He married Kelly Harmon on May 31st, 1969. And she is the sister of actor Mark Harmon, NCIS fame, and the daughter of Heisman Trophy winner Tom Harmon and actress Elise Knox. They divorced in 1972. Now, there's another connection there with, and I'll tell you more about the connection with Lee Iacocca in the next podcast. In part 2, DeLorean adopted a son whom he named Zachary Tavio, 14 months old at the time, to his marriage to model Christina Ferrar, who adopted Zachary. They had a daughter named Catherine Ann, born November 15, 1977. They divorced in 1985. He was then married to Sally Baldwin, whom he had a daughter, Sheila Baldwin DeLorean, with on February 19th of 2002. He and Sally stayed married until his death in 2005. They lived in Morristown, New Jersey, having previously resided in Bedminster, New Jersey. DeLorean died at Overlook Hospital in Summit, New Jersey, from a stroke on March 19, 2005, at the age of 80. His ashes are interned at the Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, Michigan. His tombstone shows a depiction of his DeLorean sports car with the gull-wing doors open. John DeLorean, colorful character. He had some great achievements, and he added a whole lot to the car culture of the 60s and the 70s. Plus, he added the Delorean Motor Company, which, as said before, the car was used in Back to the Future. So what did you think about DeLorean? Did you own or drive any of those cars that he had a hand in? The Pontiac Firebird, the Pontiac Grand Prix, starting with 1969. What about the Vega? Did you have or drive a Vega or the Cosworth Vega? If you did, let me know. I'd like to hear your stories about those vehicles. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little bit about John DeLorean. Very interesting character. There's a whole lot more that I can say about this. You'll need to go to Wikipedia. I'll have the link in the show notes, but go there and read the rest of what it says about John DeLorean. Very interesting guy. What's coming up next on My First Ride? Constantly searching for people that would enjoy telling the stories of their first rides and how their lives were influenced by them. And I bet you probably know someone that would be a great guest for My First Ride podcast, right? Let me know a little bit about them and their story. What about you telling your story on the podcast? Let me know a little bit about you and your first ride. Let's get you on the podcast. Check us out and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast, and more. And of course, you can also go to the website at myfirstridepodcast.com. One final thought. You may not have your first ride, but you still have the memories. It's time to share them. Contact me if you have any questions regarding today's podcast, or you'd like to be a guest on My First Ride podcast. I'm Gary Neidert, and you've just experienced My First Ride podcast. Call me 972-771-7899 or send an email to myfirstridepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.